Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holochek, and today you know me as a philosopher, historian, and Thomas Jefferson scholar, and today I'd like to talk to you about Jefferson's negligible actions or deeds to end slavery. The talk or the lecture might be titled, Are You Cold? He could have done more. That is an argument or an accusation at least given by many Jefferson scholars today about his insignificant actions to eradicate slavery. Paul Finkelman, who is one of my favorite people in all the world because he so loves Thomas Jefferson, in his paper, The Thomas Jefferson Slavery, The Myth Goes On, he gives us a really contemptuous, critique of Jefferson on slavery. He acts that acknowledges that Jefferson did some things to try to end slavery, but they were slight and of no great consequence. And he maintains that whatever actions he undertook were motivated first by acknowledging that slavery had bad implications or bad effects on white people. Didn't care about black people at all. He was also concerned that failure to eradicate slavery might mean, because of the large black slave population in Virginia, a large and significant uprising which could result into the decimation, if not annihilation. You got to get your face in the camera of the white population. And thirdly, he just simply hated blacks, according to Finkelman. So eradication implied expatriation, send them to some other island, Santo Domingo or Africa, somewhere, just get them out of sight. So again, I said he acknowledges that Jefferson had some sort of slight efforts towards eradication of slavery, but that those efforts were sort of mild and insignificant, all things considered. In 1999, Nicholas Magnus writes, I quote here, "For a politician who fought hard to establish a Republican government in the new republic, Jefferson's political efforts to end slavery were insignificant by comparison." Okay, another argument here with the implication that Jefferson certainly could have done more. If you compare that to his efforts to establish Republican government, Jefferson gave that a full effort, and his attempts to abolish slavery was given, short shrift or something like that. All right, now this Jefferson could have done more argument is present just about everywhere you look in the history books and in the papers that deal with Jefferson's personal life. You see it in Gordon Reed, you see it in Alan Taylor's recent book on Jefferson, you see it in the work of Peter Onuf. And the notion is something like Jefferson, acknowledging one, that Jefferson did, well, you said down, Jefferson did a few things to end slavery, but not many, and he could have done more and much more, possibly leading to the complete liquidation or eradication of slavery in his lifetime. You want to go down? Go down. Okay. I had to get the dog down. Sorry, Jeff. Okay, let's look at two claims here. That Jefferson did little to end slavery first, and I think that's patently ridiculous. As a Virginian lawyer, Jefferson undertook in 1770 the case of Howell versus Netherland. Without going into too much into the case, Netherland wanted, Samuel Howell wanted to be freed, and the case was rather complicated. He was not completely black. Jefferson argues, which was taking a great risk at the time. He says, under the law of nature, all men are born free. Everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person, which includes the liberty of moving and using it at his own will. This is what is called personal liberty and is given him by the author of nature, i.e. God, because necessary for his own sustenance. Now, this is a claim, prior to writing his declaration, that Jefferson said all men are born free. So this man, regardless of coloration of skin, is a man. He should be free as well. Now, the case was the defendant, the case was defended by George Wythe, and Wythe was awarded the victory even before speaking. He didn't have to say anything. Presumably, the magistrate here thought the argument that all men are born free was just so ridiculous that it didn't deserve any sort of recognition. So the case was, in some sense, awarded, right? Awarded to Netherlands. Okay. Now, what goes? Douglas Edgerton, in one of his papers, writes, okay, the only reason that Jefferson undertook this case, Samuel Howell, is just because Howell was near white. This is a silly claim. What people don't acknowledge is Jefferson had undertaken 6 cases pro bono, not accepting money for representing these black people wanting to be free. Not one. Most people acknowledge Howell versus Netherlands, but they don't go into his case book, his fee book, his docket books. And when you do that, you see he took up 6 cases. And so that shows you, and he didn't ask for any remuneration in any one of them. 1774, we jump to his summary view of the rights of British America. I talked of this last time. Jeff, you need to settle down, boy. I talked of this last time on One Word, 5 Questions with Donna Vitek, and we noticed that Jefferson accuses in this writing, he accuses King George III of contributing to the traffic of slaves into the colonies, he argues that the colonists don't want slaves, don't care to have slaves, but yet they're being, slaves are being forced upon them. How legitimate that is, who knows? But the main thing is that George could have used his negative, could have denied any sort of legislation that dealt with the traffic of slaves, and George refused to do so. So by virtue of that, he's implicated in their trafficking, and that certainly is a good argument. The same argument that Jefferson uses in his Declaration. Come on, jump and just sit down already. You're getting too crazy. Every time I get on one of these things, you got to be in the middle of it, don't you? Sit down. All right. In his first draft of the Declaration, Jefferson talks of, there's this large passage, I think it's 169 words in it, which when he's limning all of his accusations or objections to what the king has done, the last one of these 24 or so criticisms of the king concerns slavery, and it's the last for for a certain psychological effect. Sit down, Jeff. So he lifts it. He gives it last, and it's a very lengthy passage, which shows the extent to which slavery was important. Eradication was important to him, and he describes black people as capital M, capital E, capital N, and argues that all men are equally deserving of the same rights, and that's exactly what he says in Howell versus Netherlands. And of course, people don't go to that first draft. That passage was excised because the issue of slavery was a hot potato at the time, and when we're fighting for independence, trying to tell the Northerners, Southerners, that they had to give up their slaves, and even Northerners at the time. Many Southern states like Georgia objected to that. It was just too hot of an issue at the time, and it needed to be discussed. There needed to be unanimity for a war with Britain, for this Declaration of Independence, and without excising the slavery passage, there could not have been unanimity. Now, in 1778, Jefferson notes that he brought a bill before Congress to prohibit the importation of slavery of Virginia. Jefferson argues that this subject was not acted on finally until the year 78, when I brought in a bill to prevent further importation. This passed without opposition and stopped the increase of the evil by importation, leaving to future efforts its final eradication. This presumably is the bill that he wrote as part of a committee Bill 51 as part of a committee to revise the laws of Virginia. So Jefferson here is admitting to his efforts to, the bill passes, he's admitting to his efforts to stop the importation of slavery in Virginia. That's successful. Eradicating slavery, that just can't be done at the time. It's too hot of an issue. Query 18, which will be discussed in the upcoming version of One Word 5 Questions on Wednesday or Thursday of next week. Jefferson writes, it's a very strange thing because Jefferson is asked by Francois Barbé Marbois about the customs and manners and habits of the people in Virginia. And Jefferson writes about a page and a half on slavery and only on slavery, as if Virginians have no other customs or habits other than the institution of slavery. So it's a very telling passage. Jefferson writes of the ill, Finkelman talks about, as we noticed, the ill effects of slavery on white people. That's why it needs to be eradicated. Jefferson says that there. He says, slavery corrupts the slaveholders. It brings out the viciousness in people who own, how they talk down and treat like animals their slaves. But he also, adds that it destroys the industry of the slaveholders. He says, no man will labor for himself who can make another labor for him, he says. But Jefferson also adds that what it does to slaves is equally as vicious, opprobrious, and Finkelman clearly and conveniently, tendentiously omits that, right? Always omission of certain things, not giving full expression of what Jefferson says, so you can sort of cherry pick and create the argument you want. All right. What's interesting, and no scholar has noticed this. It seems to me rather strange. When Jefferson's talking about slavery, masters and slaves in Query 18, he never mentions race, right? He uses the terms, and I look here, commerce between master and slave. He says the parent, the child, the circle of smaller slavers, one half of the citizens trampling on the rights of the other. He writes of despots versus enemies. He writes of the morals of one part and the amor patriae of the other. He doesn't talk about white people and black people. He doesn't talk about Negroes, Africans, doesn't talk about Europeans, whites, and things like that. Why hasn't anybody noticed that? It's astonishing to me. Why does Jefferson not mention black and white? Because there are white slaves. There are non-black slaves. He's talking about the institution. The institution is opprobrious, morally opprobrious, and ought to be eradicated, regardless of who's master, who's slave. All right, in 1784, he writes his report for the government of Western Territory, which would be worked up into the Northwest Ordinance and passed in 1787, I think, yeah. He says, after the year 1800 of the Christian era, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in any of the said states, otherwise than in punishment of crimes, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted to have been personally guilty. So as of 1800, he's anticipating the complete eradication of slavery in the said states, he calls them. Now, this measure of eradication came close to passing. He writes in his autobiography, and I read from it. He says, there were 10 states present, 6 voted unanimously for it, and 1 was divided. 7 votes being requisite to decide the proposition affirmatively, it was lost. He says, the voice of a single individual of the state which was divided, and that state was New Jersey. New Jersey is going to be infamously known for being the state that decided the issue here, would have prevented this abominable crime from spreading itself over the new country. Thus we see the fate of millions unborn hanging on the tongue of one man, and heaven was silent in that awful moment. But it is to be hoped it will not always be silent, and that the friends to the rights of human nature will in the end prevail. A very, very powerful passage in his autobiography talking about we had a chance to eradicate slavery in the states, and because of one person not showing up and voting, and that person would have voted, would have been enough to turn it and eradicate slavery. it was not passed. Heaven was silent, says Jefferson. At his sixth message in 1806 as President of the United States, Jefferson talks about a bill which passed through Congress and Jefferson signs, prohibiting the importation of further slaves from Africa, right? So he signs the bill. And finally, we could say that upon his death, he frees Robert and James Hemmings. Actually, he frees them while he's still alive. We're at 1790s, I think. And then on his death, he frees 5 slaves. When he dies formally, his will expresses that 5 slaves should be freed. And they are. So, going back to the question, could he have done more? Okay. Now, in some sense, I argue that could he have done more? The answer to the question is clearly that the first question is Jefferson, the first concern was Jefferson didn't do much to end slavery. I think that's ridiculous. One could ask, did anybody, any major political figure in the United States at the time of Jefferson do more to try to end the vicious institution of slavery? And I think the answer is probably no. It's hard to note a high-ranking political figure who did as much as Jefferson, and he did it as a Southerner. That's a critical issue. Now, could he have done more? Well, I think the question is sort of silly, and I say so for a number of reasons. Let's take a few examples here. Mother Teresa, right? You know her, she was a Catholic. She was a Catholic nun who devoted her whole life, and I quote from her, she says, to helping the hungry, the naked, the homeless, the crippled, the blind, the leopards, all those people who feel unwanted, unloved, uncared for throughout society, people that have become a burden to the society and shunned by everyone. Now, see, when she devotes her life to helping the needy, she spends most of her time doing that. Now one could clearly state, and she did that at the expense of her health. She never took care of herself. She was always more concerned about helping other people. Consequently, she had a bad ticker. She had a heart attack. That bad heart came back to haunt her later and was part of the cause of her death. One could argue, okay, Mother Teresa, you could have done more if you had taken care of your health. You did not. So we need to inculpate her of moral lapse because she didn't do everything she could have done. Tom Brady won 251 football games, has over 89,000 passing yards, 649 passing touchdowns. He went to 10 Super Bowls and won 7 of them. Right now, Brady could have done more, right? He had days where he just was not on his game for whatever reason. So if he was on his game, he could have done more. He could, it's unknown whether he's going to play. He says he's retired, firmly says he's retired, and one could hold that against him. Well, you have all these great records, but you could have done more, Tom. Why didn't you? Look at a third figure, Ernest Hemingway, who is one of my favorite novelists, a macho sort of guy. He writes The Sun Also Rises, Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls. One of my favorite books is The Old Man and the Sea, done into a wonderful movie by a couple great actors. So Hemingway, when he was not, he liked to down them. So he spent a lot of time on binges with people like James Joyce, right? Consequently, one could say, had he not spent so much time drinking, he could and attended more to his health, blood pressure problems, he could have done more. Hemingway, you didn't do enough, right? So if we can take some of the most accomplished people in the world and apply the accusation that you could have done more, it applies to everyone. I have 24 published books on Thomas Jefferson. If I were to die tomorrow someone could say, well, Holacek, you could have done more. Of course I could have. I could have stopped and not written, some of the books on Greek moral philosophy, my book on Ukraine and other things, and devoted more attention. But how interesting is that objection? If it applies to everyone, it's just a fucking empty and stupid allegation, indicative of what I would call feckless scholarship. Anybody asks the question, it's just an empty question, so you must be a feckless scholar. What is the interesting question? The interesting question, in my estimation, is normative. Ought Jefferson to have done more? Now, the problem with this question is it has moral implications, right? People like Finkelman and Onuf clearly answer yes to this question. And what happens when you answer yes, that Jefferson ought to have done more? Clearly, they would have said yes. When you do that, what you do is you put yourself in, you imply that were I in Jefferson's position, I would have done more to eradicate slavery, perhaps even eradicated it, right? And that's just a stupid claim. I can't say that were I in Jefferson's position, I would have done more or done better. That just seems to be a ridiculous claim. Jefferson was one of the world's most accomplished human beings in his day. To say that he ought to have done more is a really, first, especially when someone did so much. There goes my cat. Go, Jeff. Especially when someone did so much, it's just a ridiculous accusation. So it's, these are the arrogant pretenders, the arrogant champions of morality. They're going to dictate for us, to decide for us whether our founding fathers were emulable. We have my cat here. Will you get out of here? Come on, Skadamusht, come on, go. They're going to dictate for us. Everybody wants to get on camera today. Skadamush wants to get on there. All right. Now, it's commonly asserted that Jefferson was uninvolved in the issue of eradication of slavery after his land ordinance 1784. That's true. I acknowledge that, and I think everybody has to acknowledge that. But in my book, Jefferson, Rethinking Thomas Jefferson's Writings on Slavery and Race, the issue, I argue, was in Greek called karos. Timeliness. The time was not right. And Jefferson says that. And I bring in the Greek not timely, simply because this was a phrase. Cheras was a term that was abundantly used in ancient Greek literature. It's in Aristotle. It's in Hippocratic writings, Greek tragedy. It was even brought into, in Romanized and brought into Roman. It was familiar to anybody who, and Adams and other people who were deeply involved in Greek reading would readily have been familiar with the term ucheras or keras. We have in English even a term keratic moment, meaning it's the right time. There's a keratic moment. Now, that was the issue for Jefferson. Why didn't he do more, or ought he have done more? Jefferson argues, Skadamush, you got to get down, buddy. Jefferson argues, no, I could not have done more. You're getting massively in my way. He shouldn't have done more, couldn't have done more. The time just wasn't right. It was too much of a hot potato. People were divided on the issue. He writes to William Burwell in 1805, I have long since given up the expectation of any provision for the extinguishment of slavery among us. There are many virtuous men who would make any sacrifices to effect it, many equally virtuous who persuade themselves either that the thing is not wrong or that it cannot be remedied, and very many with whom interest is morality. The third is an interesting category. He writes, he adds, the older we grow, the larger we are disposed to believe the last party to be. What does it mean? So in effect, I think he's arguing that there are a large number of people who think slavery needs to be liquidated. There are also an equally large number of people who think, no, slavery ought not to be because it's not morally egregious or because it just economically unfeasible. So, but he says there's this third category who argue that interest is morality. What does he mean by that? I'm not entirely sure, but I think what he's arguing is that this third category of people who can decide the issue express an interest in it without having a firm opinion one way or the other. So it's likely an affirmation of, come on, let's go, of people being interested, come on, get on my lap, being interested in the issue without being involved. Boy, doesn't that ring a bell for us today. Yeah, I have an interest, and I have an opinion, but I'm not going to get involved. The issue is most clearly and cleanly articulated in a letter just prior to his death to James Heaton, 1826 May. He says, a good cause is often injured more by ill-timed efforts of its friends than by the arguments of its enemies. Persuasion, perseverance, and patience are the best advocates on questions demanding or depending on the will of others. The revolution in public opinion which this cause requires is not to be expected in a day or perhaps in an age, but in time, which outlives all things, will outlive this evil also. My sentiments have been 40 years before the public, right? So he's saying I've been preaching this for 40 years, longer than that, clearly. Had I repeated them 40 times, they would have only become the more stale and threadbare. Although I shall not live to see them consummated, they will not die with me, but living or dying, they will ever be in my most fervent prayer. So Jefferson is noting that, the time isn't right. I can push it, I can preach, I can tell people that slavery is a bad thing. People don't want to hear it at the time. It's not going to happen. Comparison today is pushing the equity that the progressives try to do, telling all of us have to be aware of in San Francisco, for example, they want to consider legislation that all black people there should be reparations, and all black people should be given $5 million, which is going to cripple the economy. What a silly thing. What of the reparations to the Irish, to Native Americans, to all the Polish people, to the Italian people who were badly treated early in American history. Reparation just can't happen. You just need to remember the bad things and correct them, right? The notion here for Jefferson, as I've said, in my book on slavery and other books, his book on morality, doing the right thing at the wrong time is doing the wrong thing. That's what Aristotle says in book 4 of his Nicomachean Ethics. The morally appropriate action is doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons and in the right circumstances. Basically the who, what, when, where, and why, right? In the right place as well. So, morally correct action is relative to a certain situation. It doesn't mean it's not objective. It doesn't make it subjective, but it's just relativized to circumstances, and the right thing to do is doing a certain specific thing at the right time. If you fail to consider the right time to do something, you can do more wrong than do more good, right? This is, so the notion of ukeras is something Jefferson embraced. He got from Aristotle. He didn't read Aristotle that much, but he certainly found it in Cicero, who was an eclectic, not a Stoic, but he got it in Stoic thinking in Aurelius. He got it in Seneca and so forth, Epictetus, and Cicero, who talked much about Stoic thinking in his writings. So could Jefferson have freed more slaves during his life or in his will? You can say, he freed so very few, and that's another common objection. I can address this quickly. Virginian law at the time mandated that if you wanted to free slaves, they had to leave Virginia. And here comes my cat again. They had to leave Virginia, and within a year, if not, they would be claimed again as slaves. So means they had to do some traveling here. And Jefferson was clear that any slave that he was going to free had to be light-skinned and had to have a trade, had to be in possession of some trade. Come on, Scaramouche, you're getting in the way. A carpenter, a farmer, someone who's adept at making clothes, things like that. Why light-skinned? And that itself is very telling, in as much as, Jefferson was clear. He understood quite neatly that, if, what people don't ask is they think, okay, just free your slaves. Everything's going to be great. Where are you going to go? I mean, was moving into a northern state that disallowed slavery going to be a meal ticket to a great life, right? You're free, but you're still treated like garbage. So Jefferson, couldn't have freed too many slaves because he thought that, he was afraid. James Hemings, for example, who was freed, paid for his own freedom, and Jefferson freed him, 1790s, committed suicide. Are you going to go to a better life? Another problem is that could he have freed all the slaves? It was impossible. Jefferson was so deeply, it was over $1 million in debt by the time he passed, in today's money. So it would have been impossible. So if he tried to free slaves, that wouldn't have been done because the people to whom he owed money demanded that he sell his slaves and that the money from that go to eradication of his slaves. So, all right, that's that. I hopefully have shown plainly that Jefferson really probably could not have done. He could have done more, but it was an empty question. Ought he have done more? I don't know. He turned his attention to more matters that could have been done, that he could have brought to fruition, namely educational reform, the birthing of the University of Virginia. He always had to be active in something. And to the question, Jefferson, could he have done more? Yes, but everybody could. Ought he have done more? I suspect he did what he could. And the time was just not right if we follow his own assertions on that. And nonetheless, as I said, show me a person who did more to eradicate slaves and tried to eradicate the institution in his lifetime. There probably were a few, but I can't think of any prominent politician, someone with Jefferson's prominence, who did more. And to the question, Jefferson really didn't do much, that's an absurd statement. So these scholars like Onuf and Gordon Reed and Finkelman especially, who just has this sort of vendetta, he's got this agenda to bury, we talked of before, he says Jefferson's one of the creepiest people he's ever encountered, right? To me that says something about Finkelman's creepiness. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Jefferson and I, right? Are you ready to sign off? Ta-ta for now. Hope you enjoyed it, and please like the page and share with other people. Take care.